Ray had always lived a quiet and simple life. He worked at a small repair shop in a peaceful mountain town where everyone knew each other by name. Most evenings, he walked home through a narrow path that cut through a cluster of tall pine trees. It was his favorite part of the day because the cool air and the soft sound of leaves helped him relax after long hours at work. Ray enjoyed simple things: warm tea, calm nights, and the gentle silence that came with living far from busy cities. He never expected anything unusual to happen in his life. He believed surprises only belonged in movies, not in the slow, predictable rhythm of his days. But one night, when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the world seemed a little darker than usual, Ray felt something strange in the air. It was not fear, not danger, just an odd feeling, like the night was holding its breath. He pulled his jacket closer and continued down the path. As he reached the old abandoned shed at the edge of the woods, he heard a faint sound. It was soft, almost like a whisper mixed with a quiet sob. At first he thought it was the wind or maybe an animal. But then he heard it again, a small trembling sound that made him stop walking. Ray stood still for a moment. The sound was coming from behind the shed. He hesitated. He knew the place was empty and had been so for years. The shed had broken windows and a door that stayed half open no matter how many times the town tried to fix it. It was not a place anyone would choose to stay in. Still, his heart told him to check. He walked slowly toward the shed, careful not to make sudden noise that might scare whatever was hiding there. When he reached the back side, he saw something that made him freeze for a moment. Two small children were huddled together near the wall, their arms wrapped around each other. They looked very young, maybe 6 or 7 at most. But what caught Ray's attention was how different they looked from normal children. Their skin had a soft, pale glow, as if moonlight lived inside them. Their eyes were large and bright, reflecting the dim light around them in a way that seemed almost unreal. Their clothes were torn, covered in dust, and they looked tired, very tired. The children stared at Ray with wide, frightened eyes. They did not speak. They only watched him closely, ready to run if he made the wrong move. Ray slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. He knelt down a few steps away from them so he wouldn't look threatening. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently, using the calmest voice he could. "Are you two all right? Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The children didn't understand his words. Ray realized that from their confused expressions. But they seemed to understand his tone. The little girl, who was holding the boy tightly, loosened her grip just a little. The boy peeked from behind her shoulder, his glowing eyes full of worry but also curiosity. Ray felt his heart soften. They looked scared, lost, and hungry. He reached into his backpack and slowly pulled out a sandwich he had packed for dinner but hadn't eaten. He placed it on the ground and pushed it gently toward them. At first, they did not move. They stared at the food, then at Ray, then back at the food. The girl nudged the boy softly, and he stepped forward, picked up the sandwich with both hands, and brought it back between them. They smelled it carefully, as if testing whether it was safe. Only after a long pause did they begin to eat, slowly at first, then faster, like they had been starving for days. Ray watched them silently. Something in his heart told him these children were not ordinary. He didn't know what they were or where they came from, but one thing was clear. They needed help. Their small hands trembled while eating. And even though their eyes glowed softly, their faces looked tired and worried. When they finished the sandwich, Ray offered them his water bottle. The girl took it carefully, her fingers brushing Ray's hand for a moment. He felt a strange but gentle warmth where she touched him, like a soft sparkle. She took a sip and passed it to the boy. They both nodded at Ray in a shy, thankful way. Ray smiled softly. "I'm glad you liked it," he said quietly, knowing they still didn't understand his words, but maybe felt his kindness. The boy tried to stand but wobbled. Ray reached out to help him, but the boy jumped back in fear. The girl held his arm, trying to calm him. Ray understood. They were too scared to trust anyone yet. So he moved back and sat on the ground, giving them space. He stayed close enough so they wouldn't feel abandoned, yet far enough not to make them nervous. Minutes passed. The quiet night wrapped around them. The children looked at Ray again and again, as if trying to decide whether he was safe. Ray didn't rush them. He simply waited. The boy eventually took a small step toward him, then stopped. The girl followed, still holding his hand. They stood just a few feet away, studying him with those bright, star-like eyes. Ray gently opened his backpack and took out a soft scarf he used in winter. He placed it on the ground and pushed it toward them. The girl touched it and felt its warmth. She pulled it close to her chest, and Ray felt a wave of relief. She seemed comforted. As they stood there under the dim moonlight, Ray wondered where they had come from. They had no backpacks, no jackets, no signs of belonging to any nearby family. Their clothes were made from a strange material he had never seen, almost like thin silver threads woven together. The glowing skin, the strange eyes, and their silence, all of it whispered that these children were not lost tourists or missing kids from a nearby town. Still, Ray didn't worry about explanations. His heart worked faster than his mind. All he cared about was making sure they were safe. He tried to communicate through gestures. He pointed to himself and said, "Ray." Then he pointed at them with a questioning look. The boy stared at him, then looked at the girl. She touched her chest lightly and made a soft sound. Something like, "Mia." Then she pointed at the boy and made another sound that resembled Leo. Ray repeated softly, "Mira, Leo." The children blinked, surprised that he had understood. The girl nodded. The boy gave a tiny smile, the first Ray had seen from him. Ray felt warmth spread through him. They now had names, perhaps simple names he gave them, but names made them feel a little more human, a little more safe. The air grew colder as night deepened. Ray rubbed his hands together and noticed the children shivering. He stood slowly and pointed toward the path, trying to show them they could come with him to a warmer place. But they stepped back immediately, fear clouding their glowing faces again. Ray realized taking them home right away might be too much for them, so instead he sat down again and stayed with them. He didn't know how long he sat there, but he didn't leave. He stayed because they looked like they needed someone. And if staying meant they felt even a little safer, then that was enough. Little by little, the children's breathing slowed. The girl leaned her head gently on the boy's shoulder. Their eyes stopped darting around. Eventually, they sat down beside the shed again, wrapped in the scarf Ray had given. Ray stayed close, watching over them like a silent guardian. He didn't know who they were, why they glowed, or why they seemed so lost. But he promised himself he wouldn't leave them alone in the cold night. As he sat there under the quiet sky, Ray had no idea that this simple act of kindness, feeding 2 starving children, would pull him into a story far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. He had no way of knowing that their mother was not someone ordinary. He had no way of knowing that the universe was already watching, because the 2 small children beside him were far more important than he could ever guess. Ray woke up the next morning with a stiffness in his back from sitting on the cold ground, but the first thing he did was look toward the shed. The 2 children were still there, curled up together under the scarf he had given them. The soft glow from their skin had faded with the rising sun, but it was still faintly visible, like a gentle shimmer around them. Ray felt a strange mix of relief and worry. They looked peaceful now, but he knew they needed proper care, food, and rest. He walked slowly so he wouldn't startle them. As he approached, the girl opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked confused, like she wasn't sure where she was. But when she saw Ray, her expression softened. She nudged the boy beside her until he woke up too. They both sat up, still holding on to each other. Ray gave them a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said, though he knew they didn't understand the words. His voice, however, carried warmth, and they seemed to sense that. He reached into his bag and pulled out 2 pieces of bread he had packed from home earlier that morning. The children watched the food with hungry eyes, but this time they didn't seem afraid. The boy took his piece slowly, as if thinking carefully. The girl waited until he took a bite before tasting hers. They ate quietly, their eyes never leaving Ray for long. It almost felt like they were studying him, trying to understand who he was and whether he could be trusted. Ray noticed something strange again. When the sunlight touched their skin, tiny reflections scattered around them like tiny sparkles. It was beautiful, almost magical, yet soft enough that it didn't look dangerous. He wondered if they were sick or had some rare condition, but the calmness on their faces told him they were not uncomfortable. This glow seemed natural for them. After they finished eating, Ray used gestures to ask if they wanted more. They shook their heads politely. The girl even mimicked a thank you by pressing her hand to her chest and giving a small nod. Ray smiled at how gentle she was. Her manners, despite everything she faced, showed she came from a place where kindness mattered. Ray wanted to help them further, but he knew he had to be careful. If he took them into town, people might panic because of how different they looked. He could already imagine the questions, the worry, the attention. He didn't want the children to feel exposed or unsafe. For now, he decided to keep them in the quiet comfort of the woods and bring them what they needed until he understood the situation better. He stood up slowly and showed them his watch, pointing toward the town direction. Then he pointed back at them and held up his hand to say, "Wait." The children watched him closely, and after a moment, they nodded. Ray took this as a sign they understood enough to trust that he would return. He hurried home, bought some fresh bread, fruits, and a small blanket from a nearby shop, and then made his way back to the shed. The whole time, his mind kept replaying the image of the children. Every time he thought about their glowing skin, he felt a wave of curiosity. He tried to push it aside. Curiosity didn't matter. What mattered was that 2 small children needed him. When he returned to the shed, he was relieved to see them still there. They stood when they saw him, their faces lighting up with a soft glow. The boy ran up to him in small steps, though he stopped just short of reaching him. The girl walked behind him more carefully, but her expression was gentle. Ray spread the blanket on the ground and motioned for them to sit. The girl touched the blanket's soft fabric and smiled, a warm, innocent smile that made Ray's heart melt. She and the boy sat together on it. Ray handed each of them a piece of fruit. The boy bit into his right away, while the girl smelled hers first, like she was trying to understand it. Then she took a small bite, and her eyes widened as if she enjoyed the sweetness. Ray laughed softly. "You like it, huh?" he said. The girl smiled shyly. Throughout the next hour, Ray tried to communicate through simple gestures. He drew shapes in the dirt, circles to show the sun, lines to show trees, a small stick figure to show himself. The children watched him closely. When he drew the stick figure and pointed to himself, saying, "Ray," the girl tried to repeat his name. It came out soft and musical, not exactly the same, but close enough. Ray felt surprisingly happy to hear her try. Then the boy touched the dirt and drew something too. He made a shape that looked like a long oval, then added small circles around it, almost like stars or lights. Ray didn't understand at first, but the children looked at their drawing with a sad expression. The boy touched the center oval gently, then pressed his hand to his heart. Ray realized they were trying to show him something important, perhaps where they came from. Ray nodded slowly, showing he was listening. He wanted to ask more, but he didn't want to overwhelm them. The girl erased the drawing with her tiny hand and then drew 3 figures, 2 small ones and a taller one beside them. She pointed at herself and then at the boy, then pointed to the tall figure and looked up at the sky. Ray understood this too. They were telling him they had a mother, and she was not here. The sadness on the girl's face was deep but quiet, like a soft ache she carried with her. Ray reached out slowly, offering his hand. The boy looked unsure, but the girl placed her small, glowing hand over Ray's for a brief moment. A gentle warmth spread through Ray's fingers, like touching a soft ray of sunlight. It didn't hurt. It felt calm and full of emotion. The children seemed to use touch to communicate feelings they couldn't express with words. As the day passed, Ray noticed more strange things. When the children got scared by a sudden loud sound, maybe a distant truck passing by, the air around them flickered lightly, almost like invisible ripples. When they touched a rock, the rock glowed faintly for a second. It was nothing extreme or harmful, just small hints of something extraordinary. Ray wasn't afraid. Instead, he felt protective. These children weren't dangerous. They were gentle, polite, and curious. Whatever their differences were, they were still just children in need of kindness. At one point, the boy tried to lift the blanket, but his small hands couldn't grasp it well. When Ray reached to help, the blanket suddenly lifted on its own, just a few inches, before falling again. The boy looked embarrassed, as if he hadn't meant to do that. Ray blinked, surprised, but stayed calm. He didn't want the boy to feel ashamed or scared. Ray simply smiled and helped fold the blanket properly. The boy watched him carefully, then gave a small nod of gratitude. Ray knew the boy had some special ability, but he didn't make it a big deal. He wanted the children to feel normal around him. By the time the sun began to set, the children were more relaxed. They no longer flinched every time Ray moved. They stepped closer when he spoke, even if they didn't understand the words. The girl even handed him a small shiny pebble she found on the ground, as if giving him a gift. Ray accepted it with a hand on his heart, making her smile. As evening approached, Ray decided to stay with them again. He didn't want them to feel alone in the dark. They ate a light dinner together, Ray sharing his food while the children ate with soft, careful bites. The sky darkened, and the stars appeared one by one. The children looked up at them with an expression Ray had never seen before. Something like longing, like the stars were not just part of the sky, but part of their memories. They pointed at a cluster of stars far above, whispering sounds Ray couldn't understand, but he sensed their feelings. They missed something out there, something far away. Ray watched them silently, not realizing that high above the earth, beyond the stars they were pointing to, a massive search had already begun. Across the galaxy, entire fleets were looking for 2 missing children, children who belonged to someone of unimaginable importance. But Ray didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was this: 2 small children had trusted him enough to share their fear, their hunger, and even a tiny part of their story. And that trust made him more determined than ever to protect them. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know what secrets the children carried. But he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer alone in his quiet life, and neither were they. The next few days passed quietly, but Ray could feel something was changing around him. The air in the town felt different, almost heavy with an invisible question. People talked about strange lights seen in the sky at night. Some said it was just aircraft testing, others thought it was a weather issue, and a few joked it was something from space. Ray simply listened and stayed quiet. He knew the truth was much more connected to the 2 children living near the shed. Every morning, Ray visited Leo and Mira with food, warm clothes, and small things he thought might comfort them. The children slowly became more open with him. They no longer hid when he approached. Instead, They gave him shy smiles. And sometimes Mira would tug lightly on his sleeve, wanting to show him something she found, a smooth stone, a pretty leaf, or a tiny glowing insect. Leo, on the other hand, enjoyed listening to Ray talk even when he didn't understand the words. The gentle tone of Ray's voice made him feel safe. Ray brought them simple games, too, a small ball, paper to draw on, colored pencils. He hoped these things would help the children relax. When they played, their true personalities appeared. Leo was curious and energetic, always exploring the ground or trying to stack rocks. Mira was calm and thoughtful, often watching the sky as if waiting for something. Sometimes she held her hand out as though she was trying to touch something only she could see. Ray noticed that she often looked toward the same part of the sky, the northeast side, where the horizon glowed slightly at night. That glow was the same one the townspeople were talking about. Ray didn't understand what caused it, but he knew it mattered to the children. Late one afternoon, Ray saw something unusual. As he walked toward the shed carrying food, he noticed that the area around it looked as if a soft light had passed through earlier. The grass had a faint silvery shine, and the air felt warm despite the cool breeze. When he reached the children, they were sitting quietly, their faces thoughtful and a little sad. Ray sat beside them. He handed them some bread and fruit, and they accepted it gently, but he could tell their focus was somewhere else. Mira kept glancing toward the sky, and Leo sat unusually still, hugging his knees. Ray spoke softly. "Are you both all right?" He knew they couldn't understand his words, but he hoped they felt the meaning. Mira looked at him, then pointed upward. Her expression was full of longing, something too deep for a child her age. Leo pushed his tiny hands into the dirt and drew a large circle again, like he did before, and added stars around it. But this time, he added 2 small shapes inside the circle and drew many shapes around it, as if surrounding it. His hands shook slightly. Then he looked at Ray with wide, emotional eyes. Ray realized the children sensed something he couldn't see. Something was getting closer. That night, Ray sat outside with them. The sky was unusually bright. A strange glow pulsed behind the clouds. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't any type of weather he had seen. The air carried a soft humming sound, like the distant vibration of a tuning fork. The children tensed whenever the sound grew stronger, and Mira held Leo's hand tightly. Ray didn't want them to feel scared, so he sat close, letting them lean on him if they wanted. Mira eventually rested her head on his shoulder, and Ray gently placed his arm around her back. Leo leaned against his other side. They felt small, fragile, and trusting. Ray promised himself he would not let anything harm them. Suddenly, the flashlight Ray had placed beside him flickered. He knew the batteries were new, but the light dimmed and then turned on again without him touching it. The next moment, the flashlight floated a few inches off the ground. Ray blinked, unsure whether his eyes were playing tricks on him. The light spun slowly, glowing brighter than normal, then gently settled back onto the ground. Ray looked at Leo and Mira. They looked surprised, too, but not frightened. It almost seemed natural to them. Ray realized the children had abilities they didn't fully control. Maybe fear or stress caused small bursts of energy around them. He tried to act calm so they would not feel guilty or confused. He picked up the flashlight casually and gave them an encouraging smile. Mira touched his hand softly, as if thanking him for not being scared. The humming in the sky grew louder over the next few days. Ray noticed that animals in the woods behaved strangely. Birds flew in odd patterns, and sometimes they all went silent at once. Even the wind seemed to move differently, carrying tiny sparkles at night that glowed before disappearing. One evening, as Ray brought dinner for the children, he noticed Mira standing with her palms facing the sky. She looked focused. Rays of soft blue light formed around her hands, swirling gently like tiny waves. Leo watched her closely, trying to do the same, but only a small flicker appeared around his fingers. Ray stepped forward slowly. Mira saw him and quickly lowered her hands, looking shy and worried, as if afraid she had done something wrong. But Ray shook his head with a gentle smile, trying to show her it was all right. She relaxed a little, and Leo gave Ray a tiny grin. Still, Ray couldn't ignore reality. The children were not from Earth. Their abilities, their glowing skin, their drawings, the strange signs in the sky. Everything pointed to something much bigger than he first imagined. That night, the sky flickered again, brighter than ever before. A soft beam of light flashed across the horizon silently. The townspeople would probably talk about it in the morning, but Ray saw fear in Mira and Leo's eyes. They knew this light. They recognized it. Ray knelt beside them. "Are they looking for you?" he whispered, even though he knew they didn't understand his words. But Mira nodded slowly, tears gathering in her bright eyes. Leo held onto Ray's arm tightly, refusing to let go. Ray's heart tensed. He had grown attached to them. He felt like they were part of his life now, and he didn't want anything to take them away before he understood what they needed or what they were going through. The next morning, something extraordinary happened. Ray was sitting near the shed, watching the children draw symbols in the dirt. Suddenly, the trees around them rustled even though there was no wind. A soft wave of warm air brushed past Ray's face, and the ground shimmered for a moment. Then everything became still again. Leo froze. Mira grabbed Ray's hand. Their eyes glowed brighter than he had ever seen. Ray looked around, confused. Nothing looked different, but he felt something had changed, something unseen but powerful. It felt like someone far away had noticed them, not physically but emotionally, spiritually, or through some form of connection Ray could not describe. Mira's gaze drifted to the sky. Ray followed her eyes, and he felt chills run down his arms. The clouds above seemed to ripple, like someone had touched the sky from outside. Ray still had no idea who the children were or where they came from. But he knew one thing clearly now. He wasn't imagining things. The lights, the sounds, the strange shimmering. It was all real, and whatever was looking for the children was extremely close. That afternoon, Ray brought them blankets and extra food, feeling uneasy. The children tried to play, but their movements were distracted. They kept looking upward, worried and expecting something. Just before sunset, when the sky turned orange, Mira suddenly grabbed Ray's shirt and pointed toward the mountains. A soft, melting glow was spreading across the sky, far too bright to be from the sun. It grew slowly, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. Ray realized something important. Something or someone was coming. He held the children close. Leo hid against Ray's chest, and Mira wrapped her arms around both of them. Ray didn't know what would arrive, but he silently promised he would face it with them. The sky hummed again, louder now, deeper, almost like a call. Ray didn't know it yet, but the moment he feared, and the moment the children had sensed for days, was finally drawing near. Something powerful was approaching the earth, and it was coming straight for Leo and Mira. The strange light in the sky grew brighter as the hours passed, and Ray felt the air around him slowly becoming warmer, almost as if the world itself was breathing differently. He sat with Leo and Mira outside the shed, trying to comfort them, though he didn't fully understand what was coming. The children stayed close to him, holding on to his arms like they were afraid he might disappear. Their soft glow flickered every few minutes, like tiny stars trembling in the evening air. Ray tried to keep his voice calm. "It's okay. I'm here." He knew they didn't understand the words, but they understood his tone. Mira looked up at him, her eyes full of trust and fear at the same time, and Ray felt something tighten deep in his chest. The weight of the situation settled over him. Something important, something huge, was about to happen. The sky darkened earlier than usual, as though night decided to arrive before its time. But instead of darkness, the sky filled with soft waves of white and blue light that looked like gentle curtains moving in the wind. Ray had never seen anything like it. The townspeople were probably staring at the sky too, confused, but unaware of the true meaning behind these lights. To them, it might look like a strange weather pattern, but Ray knew it meant only one thing. The children's world was reaching closer. The air began to hum again, only this time it was no longer faint. The sound was clearer, almost musical, as if dozens of soft tones blended together. Leo and Mira stood up slowly, their eyes fixed on the hills behind the woods. Ray followed their gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. A huge shape appeared far in the distance, not sharp like a building, not solid like a mountain, but shimmering like a massive piece of the sky shifting into view. It wasn't a shape that belonged to Earth. It felt too smooth, too bright, too perfect. It looked like something created with a kind of technology Ray could not imagine. The children took a step forward, then stopped, unsure if they should move. Mira held Ray's hand tightly, almost asking for permission. Ray squeezed her hand back gently. He didn't know what else to do. Everything around them felt strange and unreal, but he knew the children needed him to stay calm. The shimmering shape grew larger, coming closer, and the trees around them rustled even though there was no wind. It was as if the world reacted to its presence. When the shape finally stopped moving, it hovered silently above the forest. There was no loud noise, no shaking ground, just a peaceful glow spreading across the sky, bright enough to light up the trees but soft enough not to hurt the eyes. Ray realized then that this was not a normal ship. It was something more advanced, something built by a civilization far beyond Earth's understanding. And whoever was inside was not here to cause harm. At least he hoped not. The calmness in the light made him believe that. A gentle beam of soft light flowed down from the ship, touching the ground like a floating ribbon. The beam shimmered with many colors that shifted gently, creating patterns that looked almost alive. Mira gasped quietly. Leo's small hand trembled in Ray's grip. Then, from within the beam, shapes began to form. They weren't frightening. They weren't loud. They weren't even fully solid at first. They appeared as tall, glowing outlines, slowly becoming more real as they stepped onto the ground. Their forms were made of soft light and smooth energy, almost like they were shaped from clouds but solid enough to interact with the world. Ray felt his heart beat faster. He wanted to step backward, but the children didn't move. They looked at the glowing figures with wide, emotional eyes, as if they recognized them. The glowing shapes knelt on one knee as soon as they fully stepped out of the beam. Every single one of them bowed their heads respectfully. Ray stared, confused. These tall beings, powerful enough to arrive from the sky, were kneeling, not in fear, not in weakness, but in respect. Leo and Mira were watching them silently, their eyes full of emotions Ray couldn't fully read. Then, everything became still again. The light behind the figures shifted, and a new shape began to appear. This one was different from the rest. It was taller, brighter, and carried an energy that filled the entire clearing with a calm, warm presence. The glow around this figure was soft, elegant, almost like the gentle warmth of a sunrise. As the light cleared, Ray saw a woman, tall, graceful, and surrounded by an aura that made the air shimmer around her. She carried a presence that felt powerful, yet peaceful, like she had authority not through fear, but through wisdom. Her eyes were bright, deep, and filled with a kind of kindness Ray had never seen before. But beneath that kindness there was something else. Strength, responsibility, and a deep love that stretched across worlds. Ray didn't know who she was, but when Mira and Leo saw her, they both gasped softly. Their glow brightened in an instant. Mira let go of Ray's hand and stepped forward slowly, tears filling her eyes. Leo followed her, his small steps unsteady from the overwhelming emotion. The tall woman knelt slowly, opening her arms with a trembling smile, a smile full of relief and love. The children ran into her embrace, and the soft light around them intensified until they looked like one bright shape, glowing gently in the center of the clearing. No sound came from them, but Ray felt something warm spread through the air, like the whole forest shared the moment with them. It was clear now. This woman wasn't just important. She was someone incredibly powerful, someone whose presence made even the tall, glowing guardians bow. She wasn't violent or frightening. She radiated calm authority, the kind that came from protecting many lives, not harming them. She was their mother. Ray watched the reunion quietly, feeling a strange ache in his chest. He didn't feel abandoned. He felt grateful that the children he cared for were finally safe. But he also felt a little sad, realizing they were returning to a world far away from him, beyond anything he could ever imagine. When the tall woman finally looked at Ray, her expression changed. It softened even more, becoming warm and full of gratitude. She stepped toward him gracefully, and the air shimmered with every step she took. When she stood before him, she placed a hand over her heart in a gesture of respect. Ray didn't know what to do. He felt awkward and small in front of someone who clearly held immense power, but she reached out gently and touched his arm with a kindness that surprised him. In that moment, Ray felt something, like a whisper inside his mind. Not words exactly, but emotions and images. A gentle communication he didn't know was possible. He saw flashes of the children's memories, their world, their home, their journey, their fear when they got lost. He felt their mother's pain, her desperate search across the galaxy, her hope fading until she sensed them again. He saw the gratitude she felt toward him, not just for saving her children, but for giving them love when they needed it most. Tears welled in Ray's eyes, though he didn't fully understand why. Something about her presence touched a part of him he didn't even know existed. The woman pulled back, still smiling gently. The children held onto her robe, looking at Ray with fondness, as if they wanted him to know they would never forget him. The tall guardians stepped aside, creating a path back toward the glowing beam. The children hugged Ray one last time, their small arms wrapping around him tightly. Ray held them close, feeling their warmth, wishing he could keep them safe forever, even though he knew they belonged somewhere far greater. When they stepped away, Ray whispered, "Be safe," even though they didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling. The woman nodded at Ray once more, a silent promise in her eyes. Then she turned, and together they stepped back into the gentle beam of light. The clearing glowed brighter for a moment, and the ship hummed softly like a lullaby echoing through the sky. And then, as quietly as it appeared, the ship lifted into the sky, carrying the most powerful woman in the galaxy and her children back home. Ray stood alone under the fading glow, his heart full, his world forever changed.